In the quiet, rolling hills of post-war Germany, a young woman named Anneliese Michel dreamed of a simple, virtuous life. It was the early 1970s, and to those in the small town of Klingenberg, Anneliese was the embodiment of grace. She was a devoutly religious student, a woman whose faith was not merely a habit, but the very marrow of her existence. Her aspirations were humble, yet noble. She wanted to become a teacher, to mold young minds and share the light of her convictions. However, the light she cherished was about to be eclipsed by a darkness so profound that it would challenge the boundaries of both modern medicine and ancient theology. The transition began not with a scream, but with a shudder. Suddenly, the sanctuary of prayer became a site of inexplicable terror. During her moments of quiet reflection, Anneliese began to experience violent seizures that left her body broken and her mind fractured. Even more chilling were the hallucinations that accompanied these episodes. As she knelt before the crucifix, the holy images would melt into grotesque, leering demon faces that mocked her devotion. These were not mere hallucinations of a tired mind. They felt like intrusive visitors from a lower realm, claiming territory in her very soul. Her family, desperate for answers, turned to the white halls of science. Doctors in the 1970s were quick to label her condition as a combination of epilepsy and psychosis. They prescribed a regimen of anticonvulsants and neuroleptics, hoping to quiet the electrical storms in her brain. But as the months turned into years, the medication failed to provide any relief. Instead, the side effects only seemed to strip away her remaining strength. Anneliese became convinced that her ailment was not a failure of biology, but a spiritual siege. She felt cursed, a vessel chosen for a cosmic battle that no surgeon could ever win. As the medical treatments failed, Anneliese's behavior spiraled into a realm of the macabre. The gentle student who once loved music and books began to manifest traits that defied rational explanation. In fits of unnatural fury, she would drop to the floor to eat insects, spiders, and pieces of coal. Most horrifyingly, she began to drink her own urine, driven by a force that seemed intent on stripping her of all human dignity. During these episodes, her frail frame would exhibit superhuman physical strength, requiring several grown men to hold her down. Her body became a canvas of bruises and self-inflicted wounds, yet she remained lucid enough to articulate a terrifying purpose. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Anneliese believed her suffering served a profound divine function. She spoke of vicarious atonement, the idea that she was voluntarily enduring the torments of the damned to save the sins of the modern world and wayward youth. Her parents were caught in a paralyzing emotional vice. On one hand, they saw their daughter wasting away, her weight dropping to dangerous levels. On the other, their deep Catholic faith compelled them to honor her spiritual conviction. The strain on the Michel household was immense, a house divided between parental love and the terrifying demands of religious duty. After years of failed medical intervention and pleas from the family, the Catholic Church finally shifted its stance. 2 priests were granted the rare and somber permission to perform the formal rite of exorcism. The ritual was not a quick fix, but a grueling marathon of faith. As the prayers began, the atmosphere in the room shifted, turning cold and heavy with the scent of decay. Then came the evidence that would haunt history forever. The priests recorded the sessions, and in the first audio tape, the voice that emerged from Anneliese was not her own. It was a guttural, multi-layered roar that vibrated with ancient malice. When the entity was commanded to identify itself, a voice that claimed to be Lucifer himself emerged, snarling through her vocal cords. The recording ended with a warning that this was not an ending, but a declaration of war. The battle for Anneliese's soul had only just begun. While the world would later reel from the recorded screams of Anneliese, the blueprint for such spiritual warfare had been drafted decades earlier in the suburbs of 1949 Maryland. Here, the case of a 13-year-old boy, known to history by the pseudonym Roland Doe, would provide the harrowing foundation for what the public would eventually recognize as the inspiration for The Exorcist. Roland was a solitary child, particularly close to his Aunt Harriet, a spiritualist who introduced him to the mysteries of the Ouija board. She taught him to treat the planchette as a bridge, a way to reach across the veil and communicate with those who had departed. When Harriet passed away, the bridge did not collapse. Instead, it became a highway for something that had been waiting in the shadows, watching for an open door. The transition into nightmare began with the rhythm of scratching within the walls, like frantic claws seeking purchase on the plaster. Soon, the disturbances escalated from unsettling sounds to undeniable physical manifestations. Family members watched in paralyzed horror as heavy oak tables glided across the floor without a hand to guide them, and glass shattered against walls as if thrown by an invisible, angry force. Most terrifying was the activity centered on Roland's bed. Each night, as the boy tried to sleep, the frame would shake with such violent intensity that he was frequently thrown to the floor. When his mother checked his skin, she found more than just bruises. Angry red welts would rise from his flesh, forming jagged letters and words that seemed to be carved by an invisible, hateful hand. These markings were not random. They were a cruel communication from a presence that seemed to delight in the boy's mounting terror and the family's helplessness. Believing the house itself was the source of the rot, the family fled to St. Louis to stay with relatives, hoping that distance would break the connection. But as they crossed state lines, they realized with sinking hearts that the darkness was not a haunting of place, but a possession of person. The entity traveled within Roland, a passenger that refused to disembark. This was when Father William Bodern and Father Walter Halloran were called into the fray. These men were not career exorcists. They were priests motivated by a profound, agonizing compassion for a child who was being devoured from the inside out. They entered the conflict with a mix of holy resolve and human terror, setting up a makeshift sanctuary and a secure psychiatric wing where the modern world's medicine had already admitted defeat. The ritual of exorcism is rarely a quiet affair, but with Roland, it became a literal battlefield. During one particularly intense evening, the boy's strength surged with a supernatural ferocity that defied his age and stature. With a single, lightning-fast strike, he broke Father Halloran's nose, the snap of bone echoing through the sterile room. More unsettling than the violence was the linguistic impossibility that followed. Roland, a boy with no training in classical languages, began to mock the priests in perfect, fluid Latin. His voice shifted into a register that suggested a throat of stone and fire, spitting back the very prayers meant to save him with a mockery that felt ancient and calculated. For weeks, the cycle continued without reprieve. The priests grew gaunt, their eyes sunken from sleep deprivation and the sheer spiritual weight of the confrontation. Every night was a repeat of the last, prayers, screams, and the heavy smell of sulfur and sweat. They were witnessing the slow erosion of a human soul, and their own faith was being tested in the crucible of this nightly combat. The climax of this phase arrived during a night of unprecedented agony. Roland let out a scream that didn't sound human, a sound that seemed to vibrate the foundations of the hospital. He shrieked that the Prince of Darkness would never let him go, that the boy was a permanent throne for his malice. As the priests watched in stunned silence, a fresh, bloody manifestation appeared on the boy's pale chest. It was a red, weeping map of the local hospital's layout, pinpointing exactly where they stood, as if the entity knew every inch of its prison and had no intention of ever leaving. While the maps of blood and the screams of Latin faded into the archives of the mid-century, another shadow was gathering strength in a quiet duplex in Pennsylvania decades later. The Smurl family, led by Jack Smurl, found themselves at the center of a domestic siege that defied every law of physics and reason. It began with subtle disturbances, faint odors and cold spots, but rapidly mutated into a campaign of terror that targeted the family's very bond. Jack Smurl became the primary focus of the entity's physical malice. He was subjected to brutal, unprovoked assaults within the walls of his own home, dragged from his bed by invisible hands and beaten by a force that left no fingerprints, only deep purple bruises. The entity did not just want to haunt the house. It wanted to dismantle the family unit from the inside out, using fear as a wedge to drive them into madness. Desperate for a solution that the authorities could not provide, the family reached out to renowned paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. She and Ed confirmed that this was no mere ghost or residual energy, but a powerful ancient demon that had attached itself to the Smurl lineage. The situation reached a breaking point during a massive final exorcism attempt. As the air in the room grew thick and frozen, a dark, foul-smelling cloud began to manifest near the ceiling, swirling with a density that seemed to swallow the light. The entity did not go quietly. It lashed out with a physical ferocity that the Warrens had rarely seen, physically throwing family members across the room as if they were rag dolls. The sounds of bone hitting wood and the frantic prayers of the investigators filled the air, marking the peak of the family's long and painful ordeal. But where some found a fragile peace, others found only the cold silence of the grave. Back in Germany, the battle for Anneliese Michel's soul reached its tragic and inevitable conclusion. After 67 grueling exorcism sessions, the young woman who had once dreamed of being a teacher was reduced to a shadow of her former self. Anneliese died in her bed, the official cause listed as malnutrition and dehydration. She weighed barely 68 pounds. The modern world, horrified by the intersection of medieval ritual and medical neglect, demanded justice. Her parents and the two priests who had stood by her through the roars of Lucifer were charged and convicted of negligent homicide. It was a case that left the world divided. Was she a martyr of faith who underwent vicarious atonement, or a victim of a system that chose ancient ritual over modern medicine? In stark contrast to the tragedy in Germany stands the legacy of Roland Doe. After the harrowing nights in the St. Louis hospital, the boy's liberation came not through death, but through a vision. During the final, most violent night of his ritual, Roland reportedly saw a blinding light and the figure of St. Michael the Archangel wielding a flaming sword. With a final ear-splitting cry, the entity vanished, leaving the boy in a state of sudden, profound peace. Roland reclaimed his life, living a quiet, anonymous existence as a living testament to the possibility of survival. He moved away, building a quiet future where the very shadows could no longer reach him. Today, we are left with fragments of these lives. The grainy audio tapes of Annalise's screams, the meticulously kept medical logs of Maryland doctors, and sworn testimonies of the Smurl family. These documented cases challenge the comfort of our modern skepticism, forcing us to look at the boundaries between the psychological and the spiritual. If documented cases presented here are real, and if they can reach into the lives of the devout and the innocent alike, one must wonder what truly lingers just out of sight in the corners of our own rooms. Is the darkness merely an absence of light, or is it something that watches, waits, and remembers?